The latest SC-300 exam dumps are newly updated to ensure you pass Microsoft Identity and Access Administrator exam easily and smoothly. 1. You need to configure the detection of multi-staged attacks to meet the monitoring requirements. What should you do? A. Customize the Azure Sentinel rule logic. B. Create a workbook. C. Add an Azure Sentinel playbook. D. Add Azure Sentinel data connectors. 2. You need to track application access assignments by using identity governance. The solution must meet the delegation requirements. What should you do first? A. Modify the user consent settings for the enterprise applications. B. Create a catalog. C. Create a program. D. Modify the admin consent request settings for the enterprise applications. 3. You need to configure the MFA settings for users who connect from the Boston office. The solution must meet the authentication requirements and the access requirements. What should you configure? A. Named locations that have a private IP address range. B. Named locations that have a public IP address range. C. Trusted IPs that have a public IP address range. D. Trusted IPs that have a private IP address range. 4. You need to meet the authentication requirements for leaked credentials. What should you do? A. Enable federation with Ping Federate in Azure AD Connect. B. Configure Azure AD password protection. C. Enable password hash synchronization in Azure AD Connect. D. Configure an authentication method policy in Azure AD. 5. You need to configure the detection of multi-staged attacks to meet the monitoring requirements. What should you do? A. Customize the Azure Sentinel rule logic. B. Create a workbook. C. Add Azure Sentinel data connectors. D. Add an Azure Sentinel playbook. 6. You create a log analytics workspace. You need to implement the technical requirements for auditing. What should you configure in Azure AD? A. Company branding. B. Diagnostic settings. C. External identities. D. App registrations. 7. You need to modify the settings of the user administrator role to meet the technical requirements. Which 2 actions should you perform for the role? Each correct answer presents part of the solution. Note: each correct selection is worth 1 point. A. Select require justification on activation. B. Set all assignments to active. C. Set all assignments to eligible. D. Modify the expire eligible assignments after setting. E. Select require ticket information on activation. 8. You have an Azure Active Directory, Azure AD tenant named Contoso.com that has Azure AD identity protection policies enforced. You create an Azure Sentinel instance and configure the Azure Active Directory connector. You need to ensure that Azure Sentinel can generate incidents based on the risk alerts raised by Azure AD Identity Protection. What should you do first? A. Add an Azure Sentinel data connector. B. Configure the Notify settings in Azure AD Identity Protection. C. Create an Azure Sentinel playbook. D. Modify the diagnostic settings in Azure AD. 9. Your network contains an on-premises Active Directory domain that syncs to an Azure Active Directory, Azure AD, tenant. Users sign in to computers that run Windows 10 and are joined to the domain. You plan to implement Azure AD Seamless Single Sign-On, Azure AD Seamless SSO. You need to configure the computers for Azure AD Seamless SSO. What should you do? A. Enable enterprise state roaming. B. Configure sign-in options. C. Install the Azure AD Connect authentication agent. D. Modify the intranet zone settings. 10. You have an Azure Active Directory, Azure AD, tenant that syncs to an Active Directory domain. The on-premises network contains a VPN server that authenticates to the on-premises Active Directory domain. The VPN server does not support Azure Multi-Factor Authentication, MFA. You need to recommend a solution to provide Azure MFA for VPN connections. What should you include in the recommendation? A. Azure AD Application Proxy. B. An Azure AD Password Protection Proxy. C. Network Policy Server, NPS. D. A Pass-Through Authentication Proxy.